A white guy in a suit that was worth more than my entire life challenged me with his eyes in an envelope. I, black, unwanted, was to be his ticket out of a world that hated us both. His voice shook as he said, "One night, and they'll all regret it." And I realized it wasn't just an invitation, it was a cry for help disguised as generosity. A cold wind blew trash down the street, and I stood there, staring at the gold of the letters on the paper, wondering if he saw a mirror or a weapon in me. Maybe both, but I knew this move would change everything, for him and for me. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. The envelope hit the pavement like a gunshot, crisp and white against the grime of the city street, and Naomi's eyes flicked to it before she could stop herself. Instinct, survival, the kind of reflex that comes from years of scavenging for anything that might mean something, anything that might change the math of another day with no food, no roof, no hope. She didn't move though, not yet, because the man who dropped it was still there, staring at her, his polished shoes a mockery of the cracked asphalt beneath them, his tailored coat flapping in the February wind like some kind of flag she'd never been allowed to salute. Jonathan, that's what he'd say his name was later, didn't look like he belonged here, not in this part of town where the air smelled of diesel and despair, where the buildings leaned like tired old men and the people moved like ghosts, herself included. She'd been somebody once, a paralegal with a desk and a paycheck, a life that made sense until the layoffs came, until the landlord's eviction notice, until the system chewed her up and spat her out because her skin was the wrong shade of acceptable. Now she was just another shadow, invisible until someone like him decided to look. "You dropped something," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse, sharp enough to cut through the hum of traffic a block away. He blinked, startled, like he hadn't expected her to speak, and bent to pick it up, his fingers brushing the pavement as if it might bite. "It's nothing," he muttered, but he didn't shove it back in his pocket. He held it, turned it over, stared at it like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. A wedding invitation, she saw now, gold lettering glinting in the weak sunlight, the kind of thing that belonged to a world she'd never touch again. "Looks like something," she said, and there was a challenge in it, a spark of the woman she used to be, the one who'd argued cases and demanded respect before the streets taught her to keep her head down. He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the weight of it, his blue eyes sharp with something she couldn't name, curiosity maybe, or pity, or something darker. "You ever been to a wedding?" he asked, and it was so out of left field she almost laughed, a dry, bitter sound that caught in her throat. "Not lately," she said, crossing her arms over the threadbare jacket she'd found in a dumpster last month. "Why? You selling tickets?" He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just kept staring, and that's when she felt it, the shift, the moment this stopped being random and started being something else. "I'm going to one," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "My ex's. She's marrying some guy with a bigger bank account than mine, and I need a date. Someone who'll shake things up. You interested?" Naomi froze, her mind racing, trying to parse the insanity of it. A white guy in a $1,000 coat, asking her, a black woman who hadn't showered in a week, who slept under a bridge last night, to be his +1 at some ritzy wedding? It was a joke, had to be, except his face didn't say joke. It said reckless, it said angry, it said desperate in a way she recognized because she'd felt it too, every day since the world turned its back on her. "You don't even know my name," she said, testing him, waiting for the punchline. "What's your name?" He shot back, not missing a beat. "Naomi," she said, and it felt strange to say it out loud, like giving him a piece of something she'd buried. "Jonathan," he replied, and then he held out the envelope, not to give it to her, just to show her, like it was proof of something. "I'll get you a dress. Shoes. Whatever you need. One night. You in?" She should have said no. Every instinct screamed it. Rich white men didn't pull women like her out of the gutter for anything good, not without strings, not without a catch. But there was something in his voice, a crack she couldn't ignore, and beneath that, a hunger of her own, not for his money or his world, but for a chance to stand in a room full of people who'd written her off and make them see her, really see her, even if it was just for a moment. "One night," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But if you're playing me, Jonathan, you'll regret it." He nodded, a ghost of a smirk tugging at his lips, and she wondered what kind of man looked at a wedding invitation like it was a loaded gun. She'd find out soon enough, she figured, because the streets had taught her one thing above all: nothing came free, and everything had a price. The dress fit like a lie, smooth silk hugging Naomi's skin in a way that felt foreign, like she'd borrowed someone else's life for the night. She stood in front of the department store mirror, Jonathan's credit card still warm in the clerk's hand, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Hair swept up, makeup softening the lines exhaustion had carved into her face, a deep burgundy gown that screamed money she'd never had. "You look good," Jonathan said from behind her, his voice clipped, distracted, like he was already somewhere else, maybe that wedding hall with its chandeliers and champagne flutes. She turned, caught his eyes skimming her, and felt a jolt, not flattery, but suspicion, the old street instinct that said nothing this polished came without a cost. "Good enough to pass?" she asked, her tone dry, testing him again. He met her gaze, held it a beat too long. "Good enough to make them squirm," he said, and there it was again, that edge in his voice, that hint of something jagged beneath the polish. She didn't trust him, but she'd said yes, and now here she was, stepping out of a cab 2 hours later, her heels clicking against marble as they entered the venue, a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, all white columns and manicured lawns, the kind of place that made her feel like a trespasser just breathing the air. The guests were already milling, suits and gowns flashing under the lights, laughter bubbling like the fizz in their drinks, and then it stopped, or slowed, heads turning as Jonathan strode in with her on his arm. Naomi felt the shift like a cold wind, eyes raking over her, whispers starting low and sharp behind manicured hands. "Who's that?" someone murmured, loud enough to carry. "Did he bring the help?" Another voice hissed, and she clenched her jaw, kept her chin up, because she'd learned long ago that showing weakness was how you lost. Jonathan's grip tightened on her arm, not possessive but steady, like he'd expected this, wanted it even, and she wondered again what game he was playing. They hadn't made it 10 steps before Emily appeared, blonde, radiant, the bride in a cream dress that probably cost more than Naomi's old apartment, her smile freezing as she clocked them. "Jonathan," she said, her voice honey over steel. "You came." Her eyes slid to Naomi, lingered, and Naomi saw the calculation there, the dismissal dressed up as curiosity. "And you brought Naomi," he said, casual, like it was nothing, like the room wasn't holding its breath. "My date." Emily's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "How unexpected," she said, and the word dripped with something Naomi knew too well, condescension, the kind she'd heard from bosses, landlords, cops, the kind that said you don't belong here and never will. "Nice to meet you," Naomi said, her voice calm, deliberate, because she'd be damned if she let this woman see her flinch. Emily's gaze flicked to Jonathan, then back, and she nodded, a tight little gesture, before turning away, her heels clicking like a countdown. The reception hall was worse, tables draped in white linen, waiters gliding with trays, and everywhere, eyes on her, some subtle, some blatant. A man in a tux, gray hair slicked back, leaned toward his wife and muttered, "What's he trying to prove?" loud enough for Naomi to hear. The wife smirked, sipped her wine, said, "Charity case, probably." And Naomi's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She'd expected this, sure, but expecting it didn't dull the sting, the way it stripped her down to nothing but her skin, her story erased before she could tell it. Jonathan leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "You okay?" he asked, and she almost laughed. "Okay?" She'd been a lawyer once, had a life, a future, until the world decided she didn't fit, and now she was here, a prop in his little rebellion. "I'm fine," she said, sharp enough to make him pull back, and she saw the flicker in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or doubt. "You sure about this?" she added, softer, because part of her wanted him to say no, to back out, to let her walk away before this got uglier. "I'm sure," he said, but his voice wavered, and she wondered if he was lying to himself as much as her. The night stretched on, each moment a tightrope, her sipping a drink she didn't taste, him making small talk with people who barely hid their sneers, the air thick with judgment. Then came the first real cut. A woman, older, dripping in pearls, stopped them near the dance floor. "Jonathan, dear," she said, all smiles. "Wherever did you find her?" The her was a barb, aimed straight at Naomi, and she felt it land, felt the weight of every eye in the room. "On the street," he said, blunt, defiant, and the woman's smile faltered, a gasp rippling through the crowd nearby. Naomi's stomach twisted, pride and shame warring inside her, because he'd told the truth, but it wasn't his to tell. How progressive of you, the woman said, recovering, her tone acid, and Naomi met her stare, held it, because she'd survived worse than this, worse than them. But inside, the question gnawed: what was she doing here, and how long could she stand it before the bomb went off? The band struck up a slow waltz, all strings and syrup, and Naomi watched the couples glide onto the dance floor, their movements smooth, practiced, a world away from the staccato rhythm of her life, hustling for a corner to sleep, dodging cops, scraping for coins. She stood near the edge of the room, Jonathan beside her, his jaw tight as he scanned the crowd, and she could feel it building, the pressure, the way every glance their way was a match struck against dry tinder. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, turning to her, his voice low but firm, like he'd decided something she hadn't agreed to. She hesitated, her stomach nodding. Dancing meant stepping into the spotlight, meant giving them more to judge, more to tear apart. "You sure that's a good idea?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the sea of white faces, the whispers she could hear even over the music. "Let them stare," he said, and there was that edge again, that reckless spark she didn't trust but couldn't ignore. She took his hand, let him lead her out, and the room shifted, heads turning, murmurs rising, a ripple of shock she felt in her bones. His arms slid around her waist, steady but tense, and she moved with him, stiff at first, then smoother, the old muscle memory kicking in from a life before the streets, before everything fell apart. "You're good at this," he said, quiet, close, and she caught a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I wasn't always invisible," she replied, her voice sharp, and he flinched, just enough for her to see it. The song stretched on, and she felt the weight of every stare, some curious, some hostile, all stripping her down to nothing but the color of her skin, the story they'd already written for her. Then it came, inevitable as gravity. A man broke from the crowd, mid-50s, ruddy-faced, tucked straining over a belly fed by excess. "Jonathan!" he boomed loud enough to halt the dance. "What the hell's this?" The music faltered, the room hushing, and Naomi's pulse kicked hard, her body bracing like it had 100 times before, on street corners, in offices, anywhere she'd dared to exist. "My date," Jonathan said, his arms still around her, his tone flat but daring the man to push. "Your date?" The man laughed, a harsh, barking sound, and stepped closer, his eyes raking Naomi like she was dirt on his shoe. "You pick her up off the curb? Some kind of statement, huh? Showing us all how noble you are." The words hit like a slap, and Naomi's spine stiffened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She'd heard worse, God, she'd heard worse. But here, in this glittering cage, it cut deeper, the humiliation sharpened by the audience. "Watch your mouth, Greg," Jonathan snapped, stepping forward, his voice low, dangerous, and she saw it then, the crack in his composure, the anger he'd been holding back. "Why? She's used to it, right?" Greg sneered, turning to her now, his lip curling. "What's your rate, sweetheart? He pay you by the hour to play dress-up?" The room gasped, a collective intake, and Naomi's vision narrowed, rage boiling up from a place she'd buried deep, years of slurs, of doors slammed in her face, of a system that chewed her up and left her to rot. "I'm not for sale," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Never was. You're the one who looks cheap here." Greg's face purpled, his mouth opening, but Jonathan was faster, stepping between them. "Back off," he said, his tone lethal now, and the air crackled, the crowd leaning in, hungry for the explosion. "You're embarrassing yourself." Greg spat, but he didn't move, just glared, and then Emily was there, her face pale, her eyes flashing. "Jonathan, stop this," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You're ruining everything. Take your guest and leave." The word guest hung there, heavy with disdain, and Naomi felt it land, felt the weight of every eye pinning her in place. "She's not going anywhere," Jonathan said, turning to Emily, his voice rising now, raw. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. Not anymore." Emily's lips thinned, her gaze flicking to Naomi, and there it was, the real venom, the kind that didn't need words. "You're making a fool of yourself," she said softer, to him alone, but Naomi heard it, felt the sting of being the prop in their drama. "Maybe he's just seeing clearly for once," Naomi said, stepping forward, her voice calm but unyielding, because she was done shrinking, done letting them erase her. Emily's eyes widened, shocked that she dared to speak, and the room held its breath, the tension a live wire. Enough. Came a new voice, older, colder, Emily's father, stepping in, his presence a wall of authority. Jonathan, take her and go. This is a wedding, not a circus. The ultimatum hung there, stark, final, and Naomi looked at Jonathan, saw the storm in his eyes, anger, shame, something deeper she couldn't name. He had to choose now, and she knew, whatever he picked, it wouldn't erase the line between their worlds, the one she'd felt since the moment he'd found her. The silence after Emily's father spoke was a living thing, thick and heavy, pressing against Naomi's chest as she stood there, the center of a storm she hadn't asked for. Jonathan's hand was still clenched at his side, his knuckles white, and she could see the war in him, his jaw tight, his eyes darting from Emily's father to her then back, like a man caught between two cliffs. Jonathan, the older man repeated, his voice a low growl now. I won't ask again. Take her and leave. The her was a shove, a dismissal, and Naomi felt it settle into her bones, familiar as an old scar, another reminder she was an intruder here, a thing to be removed. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, because she'd faced worse than this man's cold stare, worse than this room full of silk and sneers. But Jonathan, he flinched, just a flicker, and she saw it, the crack in his defiance. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore, Richard, he said, his voice rough, unsteady, and for a moment she thought he'd hold his ground, thought he'd choose her, this stranger he'd pulled from the shadows. The crowd murmured, a low buzz of anticipation, and Emily stepped closer, her eyes bright with something like triumph. Don't do this to yourself, she said, soft, almost pleading, and Naomi hated how it sounded genuine, how it tugged at him. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, just a fraction. You don't belong here like this, Emily added, and the this was aimed at Naomi, a knife slipped between the ribs. Naomi's throat tightened, but she kept her face still, her dignity a shield she'd forged through years of breaking. Let's go, she said to Jonathan, quiet, firm, because she wasn't about to beg, wasn't about to let them see her crack. His head snapped to her, his eyes wide, searching, and for a second she thought he'd say no, thought he'd walk out with her, leave this gilded cage behind. But then Richard spoke again, sharper now. You walk out with her, Jonathan, you're done. No more invitations, no more deals. You know what this crowd can do. It was a threat, blunt and brutal, and Naomi saw it land, saw the flicker of fear in Jonathan's eyes, the calculation. He was one of them, born into this world of power and privilege, and she was, what? A statement? A rebellion? A mistake? Jonathan, she said again, softer this time, giving him an out, because she knew, she'd always known, how this ended. He turned to her, his mouth opening, then closing, and the silence stretched, unbearable. I'm sorry, he said finally, so quiet she almost missed it, and her stomach dropped, a cold, hollow ache spreading through her. Sorry doesn't cut it, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor inside, and she stepped back, breaking the tether between them. The room watched, rapt, as she turned, her heels clicking against the marble, each step a defiance they couldn't take from her. She didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction, but she felt his eyes on her, felt the weight of his choice like a stone in her chest. Outside, the February air hit her like a slap, sharp and bitter, and she stopped on the lawn, the dress suddenly too tight, too wrong. She'd been a fool to say yes, to think one night could rewrite the rules, but she wouldn't cry, not here, not for him. Behind her, the music started again, faint through the doors, and she knew he'd stayed, knew he'd been to the pressure of that world she'd never belonged to. She walked, the cold seeping through her borrowed shoes, and thought of the streets, harsh, yes, but honest in a way this place never could be. Back inside, Jonathan stood where she'd left him, the crowd parting around him like water around a rock, their whispers a dull roar in his ears. Smart choice, Richard said, clapping a hand on his shoulder, but Jonathan shrugged it off, his face blank, hollowed out. Emily watched him, her expression unreadable, and he wondered if she saw it, the cost of staying, the piece of himself he'd just lost. You did the right thing, she said, but her voice sounded far away, drowned by the memory of Naomi's back as she walked out, her strength a rebuke he'd carry forever. He nodded, mechanical, and took a drink from a passing tray, the burn of it doing nothing to fill the emptiness. Naomi reached the edge of the estate, the city lights flickering ahead, and stopped, her breath fogging in the night. She'd survived this, survived them, but the ache lingered, Jonathan's apology, his surrender, the fleeting hope she'd let herself feel. She pulled the dress's straps tighter, a shield against the wind, and kept walking, her shadow stretching long and lone behind her, a testament to a night that had changed nothing and everything.